Hi and welcome to episode 134 of Retro Power Uncut. And this week I'm going to do the whole video because Nat is knee deep in construction tasks, which may well result in some noise. So if there's various loud sawing or banging noises through the video, I do apologise. I'm going to start with Project Kuma. So we're obviously in the later stages of dry build on this. So essentially this week Sam's just been getting the subframes in, getting it to the point of rolling, so we can then get the front wings on, which is where Tom is continuing at the minute to do the hammer forming. In fact, I think he's done the hammer forming of the front arches, and he's in the stage now of grafting the halves. He's made them all in two halves, grafting the halves together, and then once that's done, that weld needs a degree of planishing to get the shape back in the arch. So it's a case of welding the two halves together, putting them back over the hammer form tool and doing whatever planishing is necessary to get the shape back, so you've got one complete arch that's exactly the shape it should be. And once we've got to that phase, we'll be able to start cutting out the relevant bits of metalwork on this shell and grafting them into this shell. So I'm not going to go massively into this one this week, but that's where we're at. Churchill, right, there's a few things on this, few avenues of progress. One obviously right in front of me. Stu's been making the boot skin for this. Now this is actually very similar to Project Utah, the other 4-door Mark II Jag that we did, in that we're not only making a boot skin that deletes some of the original details, so there's originally a number plate plinth on there which sort of interrupts the shape of it, but also making it in aluminium. If we're making a skin, kind of seems logical to take advantage of being able to make it in a lightweight material. It's also quite, or easier I should perhaps say, for somebody with Stu's ability to shape this sort of compound curve in aluminium because of the ability for it to stretch more easily. So he's been wheeling that up on the English wheel, getting the shape in that, starting on doing the edge tipping. So he's essentially now got a 90-degree edge, which will sort of get it at this angle, ready for that to then be crimped all the way over 180 degrees to attach it to the skin. But in readiness for that, because of the difference in thickness of the aluminium we're working to compared to the original steel, to get the panel gaps right, he's been around and resized this flange around the edge of here so that we end up with the same size panel gap with the thicker skin. And then while he was at it, actually, there's various holes on here which are access holes to components that attach to the original boot lid, which won't be attached to this. And we thought while we're at it, we might as well delete those holes on the frame because they don't really serve any purpose after we've reskinned it. So that's what he's done, and I think he's pretty much at the stage now of being ready to get that skin on. So I think next week it'll be getting the bonding adhesive on here, getting the skin on, hammering it all around, clinching it on. So we'll see that next week. There's been a few small details that Stu's been on with. One was looking forward to the chrome mouldings that go around the gutters. Obviously now we've done the roof shape change, the gutter shape is different, and we're obviously aware that we're going to need to come up with a plan there. We thought we might be able to reshape them, which we could, but obviously also the B-post position is miles further back, and originally the joint is above the B-post. Now it wouldn't be horrifically offensive if it was somewhere else, but it would be more logical if it was above the B-post, and it is quite difficult to form those gutter trims. So we're trying to come up with a solution that might solve that quite elegantly. And one thing that Stu realised straight away is that on the E-type, the fixed head E-type, the gutter trim, the rear part of it is actually very, very close to the shape we've ended up with on the gutter here, more so than the Mark II trim. So we're contemplating using the rear part of an E-type trim, and then we were trying to think of something that might possibly be able to donate the front part and take it and be long enough to go back to the B-pillar. Now we're wondering whether XJ Coupe ones might work. I think there's more curve in this, but they may be close enough to work. So we've got a couple of those on the way just to have a bit of a try and see whether they work. Certainly they've got a similar screen angle and they'd be long enough. It's just whether the extra curvature in the roof is a problem or not. So watch this space on that one. He's also been on with the trailing arm mounts. So this is now running S-type independent rear end in place of the live axle. And one of the things that the independent back end has is a trailing arm which kind of does additional longitudinal location of the rear hub carrier. But rather than use the standard arms, because there's quite a nice structural section where the original trailing semi-elliptic leaf used to mount, it kind of made sense for us to make our own mount that went into that channel, because it's a nice beefy part of the car. So Stu's just fabricating some custom trailing arms that will go into that original section, which is looking pretty good. I think he's now drilled and made the tubes where they'll mount onto the chassis. He's got the main trailing arm bar made. He just needs to weld up the trailing arms, and we'll be about there with that. So that's looking good. And then on the same subject of suspension, we've obviously previously showed some of the progress on the front cross member. That's now coming together really well. Just as a bit of a recap, because I'm not sure if it's been concisely mentioned before, the reason for wanting to redo the front end is that on the original Mark II, it's a steering box. The original suspension arm system has 0 caster. It's just a straight up hub carrier, which means there's naturally no self-centering. Now what they did to combat that is have the arms mounted in quite a significant trailing way on a big angle. So that gives you some degree of self-centering while still keeping the steering really light by having no caster. But in a car where you want a bit of a performance edge to it, especially with rack and pinion steering, it's very preferable to have a reasonable amount of caster angle on there. So that's one thing we were trying to improve, is basically a nice positive feeling of self-centering on the steering. We want it to be a quicker ratio than the original. And then the other problem we have is that with the significant trailing angle on the original wishbones, it really limits your lock. These didn't have very much lock originally. And when you actually want to go with wider tyres on the front or wider wheels, you massively limit the lock, because the wheel rim actually hits the wishbone before you get any significant amount of lock on. So we wanted to redo it with arms that were closer to being straight out, not as angled back, with a reasonable amount of caster angle on there, but preferably using quite a lot of original equipment parts. So the plan that Nat came up with was Jaguar XJ arms and geometry, with a slightly shortened upper arm, which gives you a little bit more camber roll, but works with the dimensions of the inner wings on here, XJ hub carriers, and then a steering rack, which we've been trying to puzzle out which rack to use to give us a lack of bump steer and the correct Ackerman angle. And we actually eventually came up with a rack from Detroit Speed Engineering in the States, DSE. This is going to be left-hand drive, and consequently, being an American company, the racks are left-hand drive, but it's exactly what we wanted. The rack centre-to-centre ball joint width is 21.5 inches, which is very narrow for a rack and pinion rack. And the angle of the pinion's just perfect. So we've got to the point now where George has finished all the cross-member design. We've now confirmed that that rack will work. We've got the rack in the model, so we can check that the alignment of everything works there, that it was clearance on the sump, etc. And got to the point where George can now generate some engineering drawings and hand over to Sam, who's going to be fabricating that crossmember, which he's already started doing. So I think he's cut most of the components for that now, and he's in the process of actually fabricating that front subframe assembly. And that's really the sort of last bit before we can get this rolling. That's the bit we've been building up to, is wanting to get this off the jig so we can get it rolling, carry on some of the dry build jobs that need it to be off the jig, on the ramp particularly, and that was the last piece in the puzzle. Once we've done those trailing arms and got the front crossmember built, we can essentially get wheels on it and make it rolling. So that is certainly a phase we're all looking forward to on this. Just trying to think if there was a couple of other bits. I think one of the things Stu was working on was the bonnet. I think Nat mentioned previously, took us a bit of toing and froing to find a condenser and radiator arrangement that would work, actually getting the fan, radiator and condenser all in front of the engine. And one of the consequences of that was needing the bonnet latch to be slightly further forward to clear the front of the condenser. And also tackled in with that job was wanting a readily available bonnet striker and latch. And we ended up using Range Rover Classic bonnet striker and latch. It's just done a bit of fabrication work on the bonnet there to get that fitted slightly further forward than standard, and done a matching piece on the slam panel, and that will work a treat. Also did the subwoofer mounts and the boot, so we're at that point where we're thinking about things like audio installations, which is always a pleasant phase of the metalwork to be at. Right, so I'm going to hopefully not trip over this massive stash of metal. We'll talk, actually, I'll come on to this in a sec. We'll talk about the CV8. So Bobby's been on with this. Two main areas of progress this week. One was some braces between the front of the chassis and these fiberglass inner wing sections. This upper radiator mounting section here, which is how they are originally, bolts onto some studs that are captive within the fiberglass of this, but there's then nothing actually bolting that part directly to anything particularly structural. It's attached by these radiator side mounts here, but we decided to really make that whole assembly more rigid. We'd do some braces between the cross member and the underside, so rather than these being captive studs, they become bolts that go all the way through and sandwich the inner wing between the cross member and this upper radiator pack support / air intake support. So he's been on with that. That's gone really well, just a fabricated part that goes on there. And then more plumbing work, so heater pipe work he was on with. He's done these nice neat aluminium formed lines that go around the back of the inner wing there, which look really good. A little H-pipe section on there. Something on these LS engines, you need a little bit of circulation because we put a water valve in on the heater circuit which shuts the circulation off. You need something to still allow some bypass, so there's a link pipe between those two. He's also done the radiator bleed pipes. So on these, again, on the LSs, they have a little push-on spigot for the radiator bleed or the coolant bleed to bleed any air to the top of the radiator. And we were looking at doing that neatly and actually decided it would be much neater if we did threaded fittings on it. So he's converted both of them on this as two to have AN3 threaded spigots on, so we could actually do threaded air-equipped type hoses between the two there, and then one coming out to the radiator which will also have a threaded spigot on it to match. He's done the breather lines and the pipe for that just hanging at the minute, but that will go onto a spigot on the air intake pipe here. And I think that was one of the plumbing job he'd done, which is going to escape me in the heat of the moment. Yes, I forget what it was. But that's basically what he's been on with, is the heater pipe work, the remaining coolant bleed pipe work, breather pipe work, and the supports onto the chassis. So yeah, continuing dry build on that. Allegro / Integra. So we are very shortly going to be starting to strip of what we don't need out of this body now. We've obviously been preparing the chassis for that moment, but we're very close now, and I think this coming week we'll see Scott starting to cut all the superfluous bits out of that. This week he's been on with, I'm going to go this side, he's been on with finishing off the rot repair. So I think last week we saw him doing the rot repair on this section of the body here. He's finished the other side now. There was a reasonable degree of rot in it, and it's in an area where the subframe mounts at the back of the sill here, so definitely worth doing right. It was one of those rot repairs where there was lots of little frilly bits. It was almost a debate over whether it needed the whole section replacing, but as is often the case with these things, you're better just to cut it all out and make a new piece. So rot repairs completed there, and then he's been finishing off the chassis shortening. So the sort of recap on the reasoning for that is the wheelbases are a little bit different. I think 100 and something mil different on the Allegro to the Integra. So we're shortening the Integra floor pan by that amount. Nat showed previously we made like a sliding jig to be able to slide the rear section of the floor pan forward. And then the cut lines were chosen so we could keep areas that mated up really nicely, but also not lose too much strength by having a cut all in one plane. So the lower section of the tunnel here, it's double skinned, was left intact, so that wasn't cut on the same point. And then this week Scott's been fully welding. I think this was tacked in last week, but he's been fully welding all of these sections in. And we also discovered the back of the floor pan where it joins this sort of rear bulkhead piece was a little bit frilly with corrosion, so we pulled that seam apart. Scott's made a new back edge of the floor pan to get rid of that rust on there. So yeah, floor pan looking good. He's also done the seat mounts as well. Obviously when we shortened the Integra floor pan, there was a section cut out there that had the seat mount on it, so they've now been reinstated. Actually it's on the inner part here, because we are going to be using Recaro seats in it. We probably won't use the Recaro speeds that the Integra used to have, but those Recaros have the same mounting points as the Recaro LXs, the classic range Recaros, which we probably will be using. So it makes sense to actually use the original subframes and just mount the revised seats onto those. So seat mounts going back in. So yeah, it's kind of all getting to that point where we've got enough out of the way now to simply drop the Allegro body over the top. So that's a bit we're all excited to see. If I just do a little reverse over here, just with the paint booth in the corner of my eye, the Ascona, the orange Ascona, went back to the owner on Saturday. He picked that up. Really happy with that. Obviously, going from the sort of disappointment of an accident-damaged car to renewed enthusiasm to get it on the road this summer. So he's got that back. And then the guys have been carrying on with the Project 1 Escort, which I think Mark had just got into epoxy last week. So most of this week has been guide coating and block sanding epoxy. The harder detail work being on the arch extensions, because we've got this transition between the new arch and the original body shape, and it's kind of quite a tight radius, but obviously on the curvature of the arch all the way around, trying to keep the accuracy of that radius where it blends from the arch shape into the body shape, and not lose the definition and not have it looking like a 50p piece, was probably one of the more challenging parts. So again, a bit more employment of that technique of turning the lights off in the booth, casting shadows over it, and trying to make sure they're happy with everything. But it's really looking good, actually. That they have got it back on the rotisserie now to do the underside, so final prep on the underside, with a view to getting the whole thing in Raptor, so the whole underside will be raptored. And then at that point it's completely watertight with epoxy primer on the outside, Raptor on the underside, and then they'll then do the final wet sanding prior to the final paint, so I don't think it's very far off. I'd say next week we'll see Raptor on the underside and on the inside, and probably final prep for paint, and then maybe the week after we'll see final paint, who knows. Right, follow me through here. Cool. I don't think I've got the stamina to do the full tour anymore. We're used to these little half tour sessions. Okay, so in here, this is the reason I'm doing the full tour. A complete new extension to the mezzanine upstairs. And actually this is leading up to a new department, if you like, in that we're introducing a wiring harness build area. Now, we used to do wiring harness building here on a sort of fairly basic level. We've been shipping it out to Max at Bremax for a long while, who has always done and continues to do an amazing job. But it's something at the back of my mind we wanted to bring back in-house, just so we've got much better control over everything. And also, the same person who's doing that can oversee all of the electronics, as it was before. I was kind of doing the electrical overview planning. You know, other people were doing mapping, somebody was doing PDM programming, maybe me doing graphic design for displays, and then Max doing the wiring. And I want to get everything together with one person doing that. So I think in a couple of weeks' time, you'll probably meet that person. So as you can see, carnage in here. Now, we had the imp here last week, which is now gone. Can you just, somebody just knock the music down a bit? Jim, can you just turn the music down, please? Yes, so we had the imp here last week, which has now gone, and that was like the striking while the iron was hot, with the imp gone and the Ascona gone, to move all the cars out from under the area where the mezzanine's being built so we could build that. Consequently, it's absolute carnage with everything everywhere. Right, Jamie, if you go over there, I shall loiter over here. So, Camaro, we saw the radiator come back last week. John's now got that mocked up in there. That allowed us to get the inlet tracked, tested and checked to make sure it didn't foul the radiator in any way, which it didn't, so that's gone for anodising, and I think that's actually just come back today. And it's enabled John to carry on with some of the plumbing, so I think he's carried on with the finishing of the cooler plumbing to the oil cooler, or at least checking it all fits before we take the radiator back out for paint. Likewise, the aircon plumbing on the other side. And then another thing on this week, with this one, the prop shaft, which we had made up by Hauser Racing. That arrived, that's been trialled on there, that's all looking good. So I think it's essentially radiator back out now, so that can be painted, and then I think all of that can go in for the final time. No, I'm losing it. I'm losing my marbles doing this full tour. There's so much to remember. The fill ports for the radiator and power steering tanks. So this was one of the reasons for getting the radiator back in at this stage, is we had it made without them, so we could make sure they were absolutely concentric within the little sort of orifices in the engine bay. So we're going to mock those up, get those tacked on in situ, then remove the tank and the radiator, weld them on fully, so we can be absolutely sure they're in the middle of those holes. And then once that's done, we'll get the radiator painted, get that in, and that'll be in for the final time. E-Type. So chrome has been probably the subject of the week on this one. Adam's been on with all sorts of things on the bonnet. So there's the chrome mouldings that run down the join line. So for those that don't know, there's a slightly odd construction method on the E-Type bonnet. You probably remember if you watch for a long while when we painted this. On the very first one, it made more sense. The bonnet, Series 1 E-Type, the central part of the bonnet was one piece, the two sides were separate, and they all bolted on. Series 2 onwards, they decided, I guess, that the seams at the bottom are ugly and they actually get leaded over. So you've got sort of a seam along the top of the wing which you can unbolt, but that still doesn't mean you can take the side off because it's welded at the bottom. Nonetheless, you still have the seam at the top, and the reason there's a chrome moulding there is essentially to cover that seam. So Adam's been fitting those, and then he's assembled the headlamp bowls. So that's like the painted sort of back shell, if you like, and then the actual lamp holders themselves that are going in there. And then he's offered those up, just made sure all the rivets fit between the actual surround and the main part of the bonnet. Those bits actually go in, they rivet in, and they use a special kind of rivet that's got a head on it that some chrome mouldings fit onto afterwards. But they're all looking good. And then he's got the indicator / side light units on there, and he's, by the looks of it, just fitting up the front bumpers. So yeah, it's quite exciting to see that come together. It kind of gives you a little visual reference to the final look. And I think other news on this is, yes, Jamie just helped me out very conveniently there. Machining of the knock sensor bosses. I think we touched on that last week actually, that we were doing some knock sensors, and we'd love to do them mounted on the block somewhere, but unfortunately there isn't literally nowhere on the block we can mount anything. So we're doing knock sensors in the coolant bungs that sit in the head there between the spark plugs. So not a terrible place for them, it's just not as optimal as it would be towards the top of the block. So yeah, knock sensor mounts, and then I think we'll be able to get all that together and in next week. Right, Land Cruiser. James has been largely on with the Land Cruiser stuff, and it's the cable that goes from the throttle body to the gearbox. We mentioned last week that there was this kind of pivotal moment of getting the fuel rails and manifold back so we could get all of that in, the fuel system tested, etc. And there's another knock-on effect that had, is that we haven't yet got the gearbox sump on, or transmission sump on, because you need that off to access the cable that goes to it from the throttle body, which is not just a kick-down cable on this. It's a fully mechanical auto transmission, which was intentionally chosen so we didn't have any unnecessary electronics on the car. But it gets its load information from a cable to the throttle. So we need to do that cable obviously, and that was kind of standing in the way. So now we've got that in there, we can design the bracketry to mount that cable. We've got to work out all the leverage ratios to make sure it pulls the right amount. We also want some adjustability in it, so we can vary the ratio of pull at the gearbox end versus throttle openings, which will be the only adjustment we have to sort of harshen or soften the shift quality. So James is just in the process now of making up that bracket, designing all the mountings at both ends, making up the cable. So that's kind of the next step. And he's also got the main throttle cable to make, which will be less complicated. But with that done, we can then put the transmission sump on, we can then fill the transmission oil, and then we'll be happy to turn the engine over. In preparation for that, John's put a mechanical pressure gauge on the engine, which is part of our normal sort of first progress towards first fire up routine, which is to pull the plugs out so there's no cylinder pressure causing load on the bearings, and then turning the engine over with a mechanical pressure gauge on it until we see oil pressure. So that the first time we actually fire the engine up, we know there's going to be oil pressure there, and it's via a mechanical sensor. There is a gauge on there as well, which we can kind of double verify, but we always prefer to have a mechanical one on there just so there's no question mark over the electrics. So cranking the engine away over for hours thinking you've not got oil pressure when you have. So yeah, it's all kind of coming down to that first fire up, which hopefully I think the 10th of May will be electronics, sort of first electronics programming session on the engine ECU to get something in there and hopefully try and fire it up for the first time. I think actually that's been an absolutely marathon session, but we must be about getting there. The Morris, It's probably the remaining one. A lot of the cars have been covered up to stop dust getting from the construction, so I've got no visual clues here. But the Morris, I went out in that this week. Another test drive session. That kind of gave me a few little tweaks I wanted to do. Nothing major. We lost power steering, and we had a problem with the power steering before, and it's all come down to the pressure relief valve in the pump sticking. Now it was a remanufactured new remanufactured pump. We still had problems with the pressure relief valve sticking, but I think we've solved them now. So that was the first thing I wanted to get out of the way before taking it out and getting a few more miles on it. But so far, very promising. And I also got on to finishing off the boot trim installation. So last week, Dean delivered the upholstered boot panels back. I've been getting those installed, getting the carpet in the boot. James, I think last week, finished off his micro-switch installation for the boot light. And so we've got all that together now, spare wheel in there, that's all done. So yeah, further road testing on that, and we'll see where we get to with it. And I think on that note, unless I've totally forgotten the car because they're shielded in black cloth, I think that we're going to see you next week.